Hello everyone, Phreak here. Welcome to my patch 8.12 rundown. This is, or was sort of supposed to be, the end of mid-season update. Uh, what's interesting is Riot sort of announced a week or so ago that they realized that spreading out mid-season over like 4 or 5 patches, okay, 3 or 4 patches, was a bit draining and taxing on players, that they would have been better served doing it in one, and in my opinion, maybe just two. I think 2 patches would be okay. You have that 2 weeks of disruption, then you can kind of settle. But they realized that spreading out midseason was a pretty bad idea, and it was just a very long time of tumultuousness where you knew next patch it was going to change again anyway, so why bother learning anything? So my understanding is from now on they're not going to do that anymore, and the whole like 3 or 4 patch midseason is going away, which I also agree was a bad idea. Was an interesting thought at the time, but in retrospect, not a good idea. Um, they also have said that this is now, also to the patch notes here, that now that it's time to basically settle down. Let's refine the game. Let's make sure we do smaller changes and let teams get ready for Worlds. They're basically out of time to make major changes. They could probably still do some rune updates. They could probably, tweak things around a little bit if they need to, right? If we're in a spot where we were like 3 years ago, where lane swaps were 90% of games and pro play sucked to watch, they might do something like that where they, kill lane swaps or something. But as long as the game is fun to watch, as long as things are reasonably working, I expect small changes for the rest of the year until preseason after Worlds in November or so. All right, with that said, 8.12 is here. For those of you who are following the PBE, the fighter item update has been cut from the patch, partially again because of change fatigue and also because fighters are clearly working fine, is what it comes down to. Fighters seem to be plenty successful, so the point of the new items was to give fighters more late game power. Fighters don't seem to need late game power. Games are ending pretty quickly, and fighters are pretty powerful. It would be like, I was excited for the Singed buffs, but Singed is OP, so we're not buffing Singed. But I was excited for Singed buffs. Too bad. I know a lot of fighter players will still be disappointed. They were excited to get to play with new tools, and that is kind of too bad that they're not going to get these anymore, but maybe we'll see it in preseason. Who knows? Either way, let's get into the patch itself. Okay, so first up, as far as individual champion changes, buffs to Elise, 5 move speed and 5 to 25 damage onto her W. She's not terribly weak. The new Runic Echoes being stronger obviously helps her. Any AP jungler benefits from getting 20 more ability power, of course. But in general, she's sitting at like a 48 to 49% win rate in solo queue. She is normally going to Q max because Q has 2 damage abilities on it, both in human and spider form. Spider form W is not really that much of a damage ability. Either way, I don't think we see W max become a thing, though I suppose it is technically possible. I just don't think so. And ultimately, this will be, for the first 7 levels, a 5 damage buff on her W. And 5 move speed, of course, which is also quite nice. This probably puts Elise right around 50% win rate. Good Elise players will be winning more often than just their generic champion picks. I think, personally, this is enough to bring Elise back as a viable jungler. To be fair, I think with Elise at 48-49 is already a viable jungler. This game is very much early game focused. It seems to be that the game times are faster. I'm not sure if it's actually true, but anecdotally, games are ending pretty quickly. And an early game jungler like Elise tends to thrive in that kind of environment. Elise really only has 2 damage abilities, Q and W. E doesn't do anything, so any game you can end for level 13 is ideal for Elise, and this continues to help that. Elise will be very powerful. And yeah, I think that I would kind of expect to see Elise in 8.12 in solo queue as well as maybe even pro play. One other thing I want to bring up, by the way, as far as 8.12, LPL and LCK have started. European LCS starts on Thursday, NALCS starts on Saturday, all on 8.11. Due to the timing of when the Chinese and Korean leagues have started, I do not think that their week 2 will be on 8.12, although for North America and Europe it will be, barring any major issues with the patch. So, though this week the Asian regions started first, 8.12 will start with Europe and North America. I thought that was interesting. I wanted to point that out. Next up is Ezreal. Ezreal, as we can see here, got some mid-patch updates in 8.11, and from what I've seen, actually, that nerfed him very, very heavily. Ezreal did gain initially in 8.11 when all the other items got changed around, and then his build didn't change any, and in fact, Blade of the Rune King got buffed. But after the hotfix or micropatch nerfs, and also other people figuring out a little bit better how to build their champions, Ezreal ended up being in a fairly weak spot after the micropatch. So Ezreal is actually, from what I can tell, a sub 50% win rate champion and is also getting nerfed. So I think this is very unfortunate. I kind of still expect Ezreal to get buffed now in 8.13 as a result. This nerf is not gigantic. Like, he's at like 48%-ish win rate, which I think is completely passable. I think it's completely reasonable, especially Ezreal, who is a very skill-reliant champion. Him being so popular, I expect the win rate to be deflated a little bit with bad Ezreal players. Like Uzi's Ezreal still very good. Prey's Ezreal still very good. Ultimately, whatever. These changes are not very big. 3 base armor on a ranged champion is not usually that big of a deal, so I think it'll be okay. Next up, actual meaningful buffs to Kindred. Kindred definitely a weak champion right now. They could use the help. 46% win rate is pretty abysmal. Again, less Scuttle Crabs makes it really bad because Scuttles is one of the primary ways Kindred got stacks. Can't do that as reliably. I'm also glad that the buffs to Kindred are to base stats and not to stack mechanics. In my opinion, I think right now, in the way that stacks work, stacks are best as flavor, and Kindred should have their power be tied to the actual champion kit. Either way, here's where it is. And it's going to be, I didn't actually show you the thing, but there's the Elise human buff, W damage. It's about 10% more damage at all points in time. Not kind of the AP ratio, which I didn't choose to include because I didn't choose to include it. Here's the chart, though, for the Kindred attack speed buff. As far as the actual attack speed growth, you can see that eventually you get to about a 12% attack speed buff, which is really, really nice. 12% more attacks is a really big deal. As far as the Q providing another 15% more attack speed than before, you can see that buff there. This whole right-hand side column, this whole thing is base stats plus the Q included, which I think makes sense to most of you. Certainly, I think Bloodrazor is the most common enchant for Kindred, though I think I've seen Warrior as well. Either way, this is kind of how much faster you're attacking, and to a pretty meaningful degree. 17% in mid-game is quite a lot, something you should definitely care about as a Kindred player. This will be a very substantial bump in win rate, though Kindred will still be sub 50 as a result. The 15 damage on E is nice, but again, keep in mind that E only triggers after you get 3 autos off, otherwise it's just a slow. With the attack speed buff to the attack speed growth in the Q, it'll be more likely to get your 3 attacks off, and that's going to be very meaningful. Also, it was listed somewhere, maybe it was in the previous patch, but I could have sworn there were bug fixes to Kindred's W in terms of it actually scaling properly with attack speed. I don't know if that got cut from the patch notes on accident, if it got cut from the patch notes on purpose because they didn't want to mention it, or if it got cut from the patch notes because the fix didn't really happen. I don't know, but there was a version where there was a W bug fix, and I don't think it was the previous patch. I think it was this. Either way, these are very substantial buffs to Kindred. Will probably still be on the weak end due to the jungle changes, but maybe I'm wrong, and Kindred will be just fine. I don't think it'll gain 4%, though. Next up, small buffs to Lee Sin. Lee Sin was also a champion I thought was generally doing okay. About a 48% win rate in solo queue from what I saw. 2 seconds off the W and 10 to 30 more damage on the E. Certainly meaningful. Now, Lee Sin's W rank up is incredibly good. It's very much worth ranking up the W because there's like a lot more shielding. There's a lot more lifesteal. It's actually a pretty big deal to Lee Sin's survivability. But theoretically, this is enough damage to maybe make you consider putting points into E second. I don't think you'll see it, but there's a chance you will. And that's pretty cool because more damage is always exciting. I kind of always enjoyed getting new Q E max Lee Sin. That went away when W's shield at rank 1 was just destroyed like several years ago. Either way, yeah, I mean, this is fine. I don't think Lee Sin really needed buffs, and these buffs aren't really that big. So, you know, whatever. He'll gain like 0.5%. I mean, if somehow like full assassin QE max Lee Sin becomes a thing, then maybe he gains a lot more. And there's like, you can just go warrior into cleaver Sterix. I'll talk about Sterix a bit more later, but Sterix got buffed for Lee Sin. That also might be a big power bump for him. Next up, small buffs to Poppy. Poppy seems to be in a generally playable state after the, I think they were hotfix buffs or follow-up buffs in 8.11. I don't remember which. Poppy, like in the 8.10 changes, definitely got nerfed, and then Riot reacted within the next patch and buffed her back up. Poppy seems to be in a pretty playable state. From what I saw, 49% in top lane, 47% in support, but Poppy on the support role is really good against things like Yasuo to deny the dashes, things like Irelia to deny the dashes. Actually, sort of, there are now, the metagame now supports Poppy support is what I'm going for here. because there are now champions that Poppy can actually stuff in that role. So I kind of expect to see a little bit more Poppy support. Either way, pretty meaningful buffs. This passive shield gets better. Oh, but here's the Lee Sin E buff, by the way. It's 40% at all ranks. I'm doing a bad job of getting myself over to my charts, and I apologize for that. But the scaling is exactly 40% higher at all marks. It is always 1/7 more damage. Not kind of the AD ratio, which of course can deflate that a little bit. Here's the passive for the Poppy. Cooldown, buff, whatever. My brain's still not working. Only matters at level 7 and higher, so this buff means more for top lane Poppy than support Poppy. Keep that in mind, but still going from 10 to 8 seconds is a pretty big team fight buff for the later game. As far as Hammer Shock having a shorter cooldown, that's quite nice as well, of course. Going down to 4 seconds at max rank is a really big deal. 4 seconds is incredibly short as a cooldown, and that is a very big damage bump for Poppy. It seemed to be that sort of the goal with Poppy was to make her a bit more of a bruiser than a raw tank, and the fact that the cooldown for Q and the AD ratio are both getting better. Q reliance in a team fight, getting Black Cleaver, getting a Sterix Gauge seems pretty powerful. I want to point out this is a bonus attack damage, which means Sterix Gauge is going to be better for her, and again, we'll talk more about Sterix later on. But a sign of things to come, Poppy going to be pretty scary with farm, honestly. This could be a really big deal. Poppy, with the right build, could be above 50% very easily. Something to watch out for. Poppy could be a very big terror next patch. Pretty big buffs to Rumble as well. He's actually not terribly weak. He's actually at 48 to 49% right now in the top lane. I didn't look at his jungle win rate. I don't think he's getting played jungle very much in general, but either way, 20 flat power on the shield and a 0.1 higher AP ratio. Kind of nice. Equalizer damage up 50 to 200, which is pretty nice, as well as a 0.25 ability power ratio. Pretty substantial stuff. So here's the Rumble Scrap Shield buff. 25 to 10% more powerful. It's a ability you're definitely going to 1-point wonder, so it's going to be 25% more powerful for most of the game in both raw value and shield, which is quite nice. So a pretty significant shield buff. I do want to point out that Rumble's shield duration is quite short. I think it's only 2.5 seconds. Maybe only 2 seconds, I forget, but either way, it's quite short. So it is very easy to overkill your shield in terms of like, this shield is big, it doesn't matter. That's quite likely. Quite likely, actually. The duration's very short. It's quite likely. And so a lot of the time, you're not going to get the full value of this buff. So this buff is not as big as it looks like on paper, and Rumble mains know what I'm talking about. Next up is the buff to Rumble's R, and what's nice is this is the damage over the duration. So even if you only get a little bit of it, it's still the same percentage buff, right? R is always 8 to 17% more powerful in all cases. AP ratio up 17% as well. Quite good. This is a pretty substantial Rumble buff, honestly. It also makes me point out that Rumble seems to have some of the most generous AP ratios in the game. What's funny is we typically see Rumbles build a I guess what I want to call it is like a percent damage build. Like the old build used to be all flat pen. You would always go Sork Shoes into Leandries into Rylas to make your Leandries even better, and you would like never differentiate from that build. And then you went like Abyssal Scepter or Zhonya's Hourglass. You never went for the Death Cap. And what's funny is Rumble has insanely good ability power ratios, among the best ability power ratios in the game. And I feel like Rumble should be building just raw AP. Like, hey, Leandris is fine. Hey, Merlinomicon is fine. But like, Death Cap should probably be included in his build much more often. And these changes tend to be ability power biased, right? 25% more AP, 17% is as good as the max rank of the ultimate. Yeah, this is generally going to continue to push ability power as a core stat on Rumble, as opposed to like flat pen and percent damage amps as a core stat on Rumble. So I want to see that happen. I want to see that change. I think that's going to be the better builds for Rumble overall as a champion. Next up, major changes to Sejuani. So we're going to start with here. Permafrost can now be used on medium monsters. I believe this means medium Krugs. I don't believe there are other medium monsters, but maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe like the 2 other wolves count as medium monsters, but the raptors are small. I don't know for certain. It's not super obvious. I assume it would say all monsters if it meant all monsters, so I don't know exactly. Either way, there is no longer a non-champion cooldown on Permafrost, which means when it can affect monsters, also things like super minions and siege minions, you can cast it repeatedly. Stun them, break it, stun them again. That's pretty cool. And the damage is up by 10 to 30. This is an ability that you max second. Also an ability power ratio on E and W. That's kind of cool. Mana cost change shouldn't really matter too much. I don't think Sejuani has mana issues in the jungle. But yeah, so AP Sejuani is a thing. We're just going to throw that out there. And the next up, 10 to 30 damage on the ability you max second. And the cooldown is gone from non-champions. And it affects big minions. Okay, so those are buffs. Those are really big changes. Wow, okay. That's cool. You got to also bring up the fact, though, that this damage thing is different. Fury of the North, the damage versus the monsters is now 10 to 20% max health, like it is versus everything else. So I want to point out that Permafrost is going to do, with the passive damage, this 10% here, 10% of a cannon minion's max health is not very high. It's like 70 or something. So even though, throw the E, break it, yeah, I'm cool, it's like 100 total extra damage. Now, the mana cost is cheap, to be fair, but this is not a huge amount of damage. And in fact, versus jungle monsters, it's not a huge amount of damage either. And again, Icebreaker targets right there. So let's look at that. Let's look at what that actually is. So jungle monsters actually do scale a little bit past level 9. I think they stop at around level 11 for how much health they gain. But I did the first 9 levels because at a certain point, it just doesn't matter anymore. I chose 9 levels because I chose 9 levels. I could have gone more, who cares? So red and blue buff go from 2,000 to 3,000 health. Raptor, big Raptor, goes from 700 to 1,100 health and a little bit more beyond that. Again, I should have been more complete with the chart, but I wasn't. Too bad. It's close enough. It's like 200 more HP at the end of the game. Krug's actually not as tanky as you might have thought. This is big Krug. Goes from 1,200 to 2,000. Gromp, pretty tanky, almost as big as red and blue buff. And the big Wolf, about as tanky as the Gromp. Or about as tanky as the Krug, I should say. Okay. Well, remember, it used to be that it would do 400 damage to monsters. It no longer deals 400 damage to monsters. It does 10 to 20% of the target's max HP against monsters now. So first 6 levels is 10%. From 7 to 12, I believe it is, it's 15%. And from level 13 onwards, it's 20%. And so this part of this chart right here is how much health your target would need to have for 10, 15, and 20% of their max health to be equal to the 400 damage it used to deal to monsters. As you can see here, for the first 6 levels, nothing has 4,000 health. Okay. In fact, they have roughly half that much, and sometimes less, of course. Which means, wow, this ability is doing half the damage. Instead of doing 4,000 damage, it's doing 210. Sorry. Instead of doing 400 damage, it's doing 210, or 70, or 125, or 180, or 122 damage. This is much less than 400. That is a substantial nerf to her damage output. And then, okay, once you're level 7, you have your Cinder Hulk, you're fine anyway. But that is a very substantial damage to the E chunk damage output. The saving grace is you can get it off more than once. Instead of having that fairly long 10 to 8 second cooldown at about the same points in time, you can just do it again with 4 auto attacks. And that's where the substantial difference comes in. And I do not know exactly how much faster or slower the jungle clear will be. You're not going to use the ability power ratio because I'm pretty sure Sejuani has her adaptive stat turn into attack damage for the early game. And if you want to build Liandry's Torment, you can. And if you want to be AP Sejuani, of course you can. But it's hard to say how much the reduced cooldown is going to compensate for the fact that this does half as much damage to jungle monsters. I do not know reliably. I could not tell you for sure. I just don't really know. They seem to think it's going to be a buff. There are some very good junglers on staff that playtested this and probably said, yes, my jungle clear is faster. I trust that happened. Junglers better than I playtested these changes, and I assume said, yeah, she's better now. So I'm going to trust. Sejuani, by the way, definitely in a weak spot. 46% solo queue winner in the jungle, from what I saw in data, is really bad. Now, Sejuani had been a powerful jungler in pro play, even at a low win rate, so we'll see what happens. Either way, she's getting that. All right, so next up, changes to Taliyah. Taliyah got overbuffed in the 8.11 hotfix. Her Q went insane. Her E dash damage went insane. And so they're pulling back on the Q damage. Taliyah's best role ended up being jungle, by the way. And actually not by that much. Over time, it settled down to be pretty similar. That Talia jungles at 54% and Talia mids at like 53 and change. It's pretty close. But either way, very, 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 very strong champion. Probably the single best champion in the game is Talia. As a jungle or mid, very good in both. So they're pulling back on the Q buff. In 8.10, before it ever got changed, Q would do 180 to 440 damage. Then they buffed the crap out of it, and it now went from 230 to 578. And then at 8.12, they pull back a little bit, split the difference, and it goes from 210 to 510, which is a 12% damage cut compared to before. That is a meaningful nerf. That will definitely shed some win rate off the champion. Talia will probably remain above 50%, but is no longer quite that wave clear goddess she was before. That was the goal of the changes. Like, to be fair, Riot found a way to hopefully reduce Talia's pro power while buffing her power in solo queue. And if the 50% with this change was the first numbers that we saw here, and she was at this, maybe this would have been, about right. Either way, I think Talia gets close to 50%. I think she will still remain above 50%, but I also think that this will remain as Talia's best role in the jungle. I actually did talk to the designer on these changes where I said, hey, I don't think these are the right changes. I think this will retain Talia's best role being jungle. And his opinion was that jungle Talia can use unworked ground on her ganks better than mid Talia can use unworked ground in the lane. Because this change, of course, only affects hitting Q on unworked ground, getting all 5 shots off. Now that's fairly true, right? It is when you're playing the mid lane and worked ground has a 2-minute long cooldown, it takes 4 waves to get unworked ground back until you get more CDR. Then it's 3 waves to get unworked ground back to get, a solid like 25-30% CDR. However, my opinion is still that more of Talia's mid lane power budget is in her Q than jungle Talia's power budget, who is going to cast only 1 Q anyway and seismic shove you back into her team, and the rest of the people are going to kill. Like, my opinion is Talia jungle is good because her Q, and this is unaffected for her jungle clear, by the way. This is only champion damage. My opinion is jungle Talia is good because her clear is fast and because she has CC on ganks and runs around the map really fast. The Q damage is nice, but the 12% damage off her Q is not as big of a deal as it is for mid lane. That's my opinion. We'll see if it's actually true. Either way, this will still be a nerf to Talia. Okay, next up is Yorick, and we keep talking about this. Steric's gauge is getting a shift. We'll talk about it when it gets there. Either way, Yorick is a reasonably powerful champion, 50 to 51% win rate, but because he has no bonus AD ratios on the kit, he doesn't get any positive benefits out of the Steric's change, and because Triforce Steric's were like his only offensive items, that going down meant they just wanted to buff the Q cooldown, so they did. I didn't do a chart for it. He'll end up in about the same place, I feel like. That it's going to be fine. Next up, okay, bug fix for Jhin with Storm Racer. That's good because that kind of sucks. Storm Racer is a pretty big item for him. A recap of the mid-patch updates for 8.11. Interestingly enough, as builds settled, it seems like Ezreal and Kai'Sa both ended up in slightly weak spots. These Pyke changes have put him to a pretty high 40s win rate, like 47, 48 in a lot of roles. Pyke is in a pretty good spot for 2 weeks after release. He probably ends up being slightly overtuned at the end of the day once people learn the champion, but for now, he's in a pretty good spot. And I think the micro patch landed him in a pretty good place, so that's cool. Good job, Riot. Next up, these buffs to Yasuo to compensate for the fact that his items got a lot worse. Ended up pretty well as well, actually. They lined up in a pretty good spot, and Yasuo is pretty reasonable, actually. He's a 50-ish% win rate bot laner, though experts are doing much better on him because Yasuo's a hard-to-play champion. Seems to be in a pretty reasonable spot, jungle mid-top as well. So, yeah, Yasuo's in a decent spot. That's cool. I'm glad to see that. These micro patches ended up pretty well. Again, I think Kai'Sa is probably in a bit of a weak spot. But being that Kai'Sa is a pretty hard-to-play champion, I'm sure people will figure out how to play her, and we'll be fine at the end of the day. Next up, a systemic change. Shields get weaker this patch. Janna, Karma, Lulu, and Orianna all have reduced duration on their shields. In Janna's case, it's decay, so that if you don't take any damage, you keep the AD buff the whole time. Karma's shield down 1.5 seconds. Lulu's shield down 3.5 seconds. Orianna's shield down 1.5 seconds. Janna was actually overpowered, was a pretty high win rate champion, 52%. Also, interestingly enough, people say, LOL, Diamond 5, 0 LP Janna main. Janna is actually... Janna's actually not that easy to play. Like, yes, you can get stuff out of her by being a newbie at Janna, but Janna has actually one of the steepest and highest mastery curves in the game. Like, Janna has a lot more skill growth than most other supports. The Q, the R, her laning phase, and now with the E cooldown nerfs from last year, her E is actually reasonably difficult to use. On the scale of supports, like, we're not saying she's full Thresh, but she's still up there in terms of actual mastery curve. The reason people make fun of Janna players is because Janna's overpowered. Good Jannas are freaking insane, and bad Jannas are still very good. That's called being overpowered. And so if you just shift her here, then good Jannas are good and bad Jannas are bad, where all champions should be. So I'm glad to see a generic power down on Janna, and truly I mean this. Janna actually requires skill to play well if she's nerfed to the part where she's not just dumb overtuned. So that's a good thing in my opinion. End of the day, Janna could use this nerf. Where it does stand out though is we have Karma and Lulu who tend to be... Well, so Karma's actually a bit weak. Karma's like 47% win rate, but of course is still a popular mid lane pick, so that's kind of interesting. Do want to point out though that like a lot of general solo queue players are only 1.1ing E for a while anyway. Like in pro play, they're maxing E. And with a gigantic shield, it is easy to not use the full duration. With a small shield, it is hard to not use the full duration if you time your ability well at all. So if you're playing solo queue Karma and you're maxing Q and you're putting 1 point E until level 8, you're not going to feel this nerf as much. It will still exist. It still matters. Keep in mind the move speed change, or the move speed buff, is not affected by this at all. Karma still gets the same move speed. It's just the shield, the damage block duration. But this will still be a nerf to Karma. She will still lose some win rate. I don't think she'll lose that much, though, in my opinion, but I've been wrong before. Lulu was actually a pretty powerful champion, actually. She was above 50% in both mid lane and support, actually. So Lulu could actually use nerfs. She's very strong. Want to point out that, no, the Pix ally duration is not affected. It's only the shield duration. But this is a pretty substantial shield duration nerf. This will definitely, I think, drop Lulu's sub 50% win rate. This is a much bigger shield cut than this one. And I think that's a good thing. Again, I like the idea of the shield being sort of intentionally timed. Also want to point out that a lot of Lulu players just press W and E on you at the same time and say, go take your buffs, go fight, and then you run at them. And after like 2.5 seconds, you can now say, okay, well, we'll just hit you because you're squishy again. So this is going to create actually a lot of decision-making on Lulu. Do I give you attack damage early with the Pix attachment, or do I shield damage at the right time? And this is a good change. I like that. I like that it's going to require some timing, some skill from Lulu for that. Orianna, same nerf again. Much like Karma, I think this is a much smaller nerf. Just because, I mean, partially is the duration is smaller, but also Orianna has a lot more going on in the kit. You always max E last anyway, so again, it is easy to overkill the shield over 2.5 seconds, so a lot of times this won't matter, and that's just fine. Next up, nerfs to Forbidden Idol, losing CDR and some heal power. Censor and Crucible and Redemption, all losing some heal and shield power as well. Compensating that is Anthene's Holy Grail is getting a bit stronger in the damage to healing ratio. So as far as that stacking shielding and healing power, if you did buy all three, and you typically didn't, you went from doing 1.4x to 1.31x your healing and shielding. And the items still have ability power ratios and mana regen and CDR and other buffs, and this really is not that big of a nerf. When you buy Ardent Censor, you go from doing 110% to 108%. That is basically not a nerf. It essentially doesn't exist. 3 items in the late game scenario can happen. Doesn't all that frequently, but can. And again, you go from 1.4 to 1.31. Essentially not a real nerf. Truly not a big deal. Truly not a big deal. It technically exists. People who hate shield supports would go, hallelujah, they nerf shield supports. And shield supports go, oh my god, you nerfed my champion. And here I am doing math going like, eh? Like, it does exist. It can matter. Don't get me wrong. It's not 0. But it is an additive 9% shielding cut. It's just not that big of a deal. At the end of the day, Athene's got buffed by 40%. 25% damage to blood becomes 35% damage to blood, which is a 40% more blood. 40% more blood is a lot more blood to then heal your teammates with. Now, from what I have seen, it is fairly easy to overcap Athene's Unholy Grail. If you're playing Nidalee on ARAM and you throw a spear, you are probably going to overcap anyway, so there's going to be plenty of champions where it's not a buff a lot of the time. This is a buff that looks bigger on paper than it probably is in the real world. That said, I love Athene's as an item. It gives you a lot of stats. It feels really good as a support player to get that. What's also cool is it means it's an item that you're going to try to sneak in during one of these builds because there's more power here and less power here, so maybe you're going to buy Athene's more. I like Athene's. I want Athene's to be good. That is cool. And for all the mid-karmas out there who are buying Athene's and lost power due to this change, well, you now have stronger Athene's. So a lot of these champions are not losing that much power. What's also interesting is it pushes you towards playing Q-Max Karma. Because you know what? I'm going to go ahead and land my Q, get that damage out, and then Mantra E, shield my team, heal them back up with Athene's. So that's kind of cool. Next up, Banner of Command removed from the game. There's a context paragraph here that's going to basically repeat what I said, which is that basically, yeah, Banner of Command, when it's been good, has been kind of unfun for the game. I know there were players who enjoyed using it. They got some gameplay out of it. They felt like they could affect the map. I agree. Banner of Command has been a powerful item before. That's true. Anytime something is powerful, it no longer exists, people who use that power have less power. That's a fact. But I do agree with the take that Banner of Command tends to remove fun from the game, so yeah. Okay, next up is what I think is probably the single biggest change in the patch, and it is Steric's Gauge now gives bonus attack damage instead of base attack damage. Now in League of Legends, there are 3 kinds of attack damage ratios. There is base AD, which is exactly what it sounds like, and it affects Trinity Force, and it affects mages dealing damage to turrets. Then there is total AD. Total AD is exactly what it sounds like. It is your total attack damage. And a lot of Juggernauts have total AD ratios. Darius Q, Wukong R, Wukong Q, Garen's Q and E, Aurelia Q. There's a lot of those out there. Caitlyn Q also is total AD. And it scales with the game. It scales with you leveling up. It also scales with bonus attack damage buys. Then the third one is bonus attack damage, and it's attack damage gained from items. There's plenty of champions out there that only have bonus attack damage ratios that Steric's Gauge would not affect. Lee Sin was a primary example of this, of a champion that has lots of attack damage ratios, but they're all bonuses on Q, E, and R. And I really wanted to be able to buy Steric's on Lee Sin and not feel bad about it. And now you can. Basically, Steric's Gauge now gives bonus AD instead of base AD, so it no longer affects mages auto-attacking turrets, and it no longer affects Trinity Force or other Sheen items, which is a very big deal. If you're a Sheen user, like Aurelia, you lost power because Steric's Gauge gave you essentially your total base attack damage as bonus damage on a Trinity Force proc. Because Trinity Force does double your base attack damage, Steric's Gauge gives you 50%, that's a lot of damage. Trinity Force, which is like 112 or something more damage when you bought Steric's Gauge. That's a lot. That is a lot. In addition to the fact that it gave you AD as well, because AD is good. Now the fact that it gives bonus AD changes the users. It still can be good on Trinity Force users. Trinity Force users tend to use attack damage ratios and deal damage. That can be fine. This can still be a good item, just not as spiky on them. What I'm excited about, though, is I can play Lee Sin and go Warrior into Cleaver, into Steric's Gauge, and not feel bad about buying Steric's Gauge. There are a lot of champions out there, I think, that really like the ability to use bonus attack damage ratios, would like to use Steric's Gauge as an item, and can now buy it. This is going to be really, really nice on a lot of champions. Jarvan and Lee Sin being 2 of the most obvious examples of champs that want to go hard, want a bruiser item, and only have bonus AD ratios. Other ones out there, you guys who all play your own mains, you probably know who they are. This is a really big change. I like this as someone who likes playing AD Lee Sin, AD Jarvan. That's cool. Maz shield back up to 5 seconds from 3. That's good as well. Presence of Mind now works properly alongside things like Riven and Talon, and probably like Annie and whatnot can use Presence of Mind better. That's a good thing. Better rune. Very, very, very strong. These champions, by the way, Presence of Mind is going to be pretty sick. I think it's already a very good rune, and it's going to be even stronger. Sorcery. Celerity getting pretty big changes. This is actually quite meaningful. So Celerity is getting half the move speed benefit, but double the adaptive stat benefit. So I ran some numbers before this. I didn't have a chart included because it's not that important. Basically, I looked at an example case of the least good celerity user who still uses celerity, Ashe. Ashe has no move speed hooks on her kit at all. She likes attack damage, but that's it. And celerity was still pretty much always the best rune in that slot on Ashe. In fact, it's so good that pretty much every marksman player always goes sorcery secondary, and they pretty much all run celerity and gathering storm. So I ran the numbers and said, okay, if you are Ashe, you have no move speed buffs on your kit, you buy Berserker's Greaves, you buy 2 Zeals, and you run celerity. It gave an equal gold value worth of attack damage as it gave worth of movement speed. So now it's doubled that, and that was 4.5 attack damage and like 12 or something move speed. Those are worth about the same amount of gold. Now, that 12 move speed is going to become 6 move speed, and that 4.5 attack damage is going to become 9 attack damage. Well, slightly less because you're going to get less move speed out of the celerity buff, but the Zeals and the like boots too were carrying that. However, as we all know, movement speed is an undercosted stat. There's a reason every one of us buys boots of speed aside from Cassiopeia players, because boots are very, very, very good. They're very cheap, and they're pretty much mandatory. Even in 6-item builds, people are loath to sell their boots for more expensive items because they know move speed is really, really valuable. So a pure gold perspective is not really the fair way to look at celerity. In a lot of cases, yeah, your movement speed was more than half of the reason why you got the rune, and the attack damage was kind of nice. What's, I think, really cool about this change is it pushes celerity away from being a good early game rune for people without move speed buffs, because if you're Hecarim, you care about celerity's doubling how much attack damage it gives you because you run fast a lot. If you use Black Cleaver or Dead Man's Plate or Predator or stuff a lot, you might care about this quite a bit. If you're sitting in the river with Water Walking because you're a jungler and you run that rune, you're going to get even more attack damage or ability power out of celerity. So there's sharper synergies. But if you're Ashe running in a lane at level 1, this gives you half the move speed it did before and even less attack damage. And it's even less valuable for you as a player. I like that. I think that's good. It's a good sharpening. Essentially what it means is for the good celerity users, it's going to be better. I think that people are going to hop off celerity and go to the more powerful rune in sorcery, which is Nullifying Orb, more frequently. And I think we're going to see more of Nullifying Orb plus Gathering Storm, or maybe Nullifying Orb plus Absolute Focus. But celerity, I think, is sharpened. That's a good thing, because it was almost optimal on basically everyone. Left side assist is getting slightly weaker. That's just fine. Oh, and they buffed Halo Blades. Halo Blades up by 25% attack speed is a very good thing as well. It was definitely weak on basically everyone. Did not seem to be a very effective rune, so I'm glad to see it buffed. I think it'll probably still be on the slightly weak side, but maybe I'm wrong. Okay, so next up, emotes existing, looking better. You can turn off the wall art next to their portrait. More new emotes, that's cool. A very small number of bug fixes. I had heard reports, I'm not sure if they're true, but I'll report them. I had heard reports that there were lots of bugs with Storm Razor, that it didn't work with things like Static Shiv. I'm not sure if that's true or not. But it did, there was a bug with Jhin that was earlier in the patch notes that got fixed. Corki with Hurricane. Ivern had some weird things. Scuttle could sometimes heal itself. Deadman's Plate deals the right damage type for ranged users. Yeah, like these things aren't very gameplay impacting, so not very big as bug fixes. Upcoming skins, these look pretty cool. That's nice. Shout out to the World Cup. Some chromas as well. Cool stuff. So that's the patch. Let's do the TLDR. 8.12, a pretty small patch, no longer includes fighter items. Elise should be back up to a very viable state. If you're a good Elise player, you should have a lot of effectiveness with this champion. Ezreal should not be worth picking unless you are a very good Ezreal player after the micro patch, and these nerfs, Ezreal is apparently pretty weak. Kindred, much deserved buffs, will probably still be sub 50 win rate, but still very, very massive buffs that Kindred needs. Lee Sin slightly sub 50, but I think that's fine. He's a hard to play champion. These buffs are quite nice. He'll gain 1%-ish. We might see AD Lee Sin with this become very, very powerful, where you max E second, and he becomes a hard assassin. That'd be cool. I like that play style. Very large buffs to Poppy. I think this Q cooldown and attack damage buff are very big deals. She can use Steric's Gauge with the buffs to it. She can use a Black Cleaver pretty well. Late game laning phase buff, or late game range buff, I should say. It's not really laning phase. Yeah, Poppy's going to be definitely, I think, above 50% in top lane and a viable support when you're seeing Aurelias and Yasuo's down there. Rumble, some pretty substantial buffs. Wasn't in that bad of a shape, and these are pretty big buffs. I expect him to get very close to 50% win rate as a result of these changes. If you're a Rumble main, you should have a good time playing him. Sejuani getting some pretty big changes. The big one is there's no longer a cooldown on jungle monsters, and the damage is basically down a lot against them. This, I believe, will end up being a buff, which she needs. She's in a pretty weak spot. Also, AP Sejuani now exists because ability power ratios. That's kind of cool. Tilia was definitely the best mid laner and the best jungler in the game after the 8.11 micro patch due to these changes. This change will nerf her a little bit, but I believe Tilia will still be above 50% win rate, and her best role will probably remain jungle, though will still be a very good mid laner. And we'll see if she actually requires follow-up nerfs or not. Yorick getting some compensation buffs for the fact that he's losing Steric's Trinity Force as a synergy. Yorick was fairly powerful before, should remain pretty strong after. Shouldn't be major changes overall to the champion. Jhin bug fix with his passive and Stormrazor, that's kind of nice. Recap on the mid-patch updates. Kai'Sa ended up weak, Pyke is in a pretty good spot, Yasuo's pretty strong. Overall, shields are getting reduced in duration. Gianna's going to decay. Karma, Lulu, and Orianna all last less long. Orianna and Janna won't feel this very much. Karma will feel it a little bit. Lulu is pretty strong. Will feel it quite a bit. Forbidden Idol, Ardent Censer, and Mikhail's all getting slightly nerfed. Not as big as it looks like on paper, so it's not going to mean all that much. Shield supports, if you want to run them, will still be generally fine. Karma might require follow-up buffs. Oh well. Athene's getting buffed is quite nice, though, so that now if you're a slightly more offensive champion, like, let's say, Sona or Karma, even Lulu in some cases, like for the mid lane supports who are dealing damage, they're going to really like new Athenes, and that's going to be cool. Banner of Command gone from the game. I think it's a good thing. Lanes should feel a lot more fair to play, and that's cool. Steric's Gauge buff to give bonus, well, I shouldn't say buff, change to give bonus attack damage instead of base attack damage. Nerfs it for Triforce, buffs it for Poppy and Lee Sin and Jarvan and all those fun guys. I think we'll see overall more Steric's Gauge on more users, and that makes me happy because I like Steric's as an item, and I like to play champions that buy new bonus AD Steric's. I'm happy about this. Moss Maw bug fix, quick changes in runes, presence of mind better for ultimates, celerity sharpened, weaker in the general case, which is fine. Halo Blades buff, but in my opinion, probably still weak. That's cool. And that's going to do it for gameplay impacting changes in this patch. Hope you enjoyed. Leave me some comments, and I will hopefully be back next week with follow-up on how much this really did affect the game. See you next time.